Have you ever felt like you were losing everything? And no one even noticed? Like your whole life was crumbling right in front of your eyes, and you didn't even have the strength to ask for help? That's exactly how Lucas felt. And on that gray morning, he could barely recognize who he was anymore. The rent had been overdue for weeks. The phone had stopped ringing with new opportunities, and the silence in the house weighed on him like a ton of bricks. Every little sound, the ticking clock, the creak of the old chair, the wind hitting the window, felt like it was mocking his inability to change his own story. Olivia, his wife, tried to hide her worry as she made a simple pot of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, but even those small gestures that used to bring comfort couldn't cut through the tension hanging over their home. Their words had become short, their conversations almost non-existent. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the heaviness of fear, frustration, helplessness. It was like they were both trying to shield each other from the pain they knew the other was carrying. Lucas spent the morning sitting on the couch, staring at a fixed spot on the wall. His mind spun in circles. Where did I go wrong? How am I going to fix this? What if there's no way out? The pressure was suffocating. It felt like every dream he and Olivia had built was collapsing, and he was just sitting there, powerless to stop it. By the afternoon, he decided to go outside. He needed to breathe, to think. Or maybe just escape the feeling of failure that clung to every corner of the house. He threw on his worn-out jacket, laced up his beat-up sneakers, and left without a destination. He walked through the city streets, feeling the cold sting his face. Storefronts looked like distant, unreachable worlds. People laughed in warm cafes. Kids ran along the sidewalks. Couples walked hand in hand. And there he was, a young man who once had big dreams, now lost in steps that led nowhere. As the sun started slipping behind heavy clouds and the air grew colder, Lucas stopped at a busy crosswalk and, for the first time in a long time, seriously thought about giving up. There was no going back, no clear way forward. He was just stuck, trapped in a crossing with no bridge, no map, no promise of a future. Tired, he found a small park bench almost hidden behind some leafless trees. He sat down, his face buried in his hands, while the city moved on without noticing him. The tears came without warning, silent and hot against the cold afternoon air. It wasn't just sadness. It was a silent mourning for everything he thought he would be. For the promises he couldn't keep. For the dreams that now seemed buried under the weight of reality. And then, right there in the middle of his silent crying and what felt like endless despair, Lucas heard a soft, kind voice. "Are you all right, son?" He looked up, confused, and saw an elderly woman with white hair, tender eyes, and a serene smile. She held a simple grocery bag and looked just as out of place in that busy urban scene as a flower growing through the cracks of a sidewalk. Lucas hesitated, quickly wiping his face on his jacket sleeve. He didn't know what to say. Shame and desperation tangled in his throat. But the old woman didn't seem to expect an answer. She just smiled, sat beside him on the cold bench, and stayed silent for a moment, like she understood that sometimes presence matters more than words. Adjusting the bag on her lap, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through the tears and said gently, "You know, sometimes God lets us lose a few things, so we can gain what we can't yet see." Lucas stayed quiet, trying to figure out if those words were meant for him or just thrown into the wind. But somehow, they hit a forgotten part of his heart. "I've been through a lot in my life," she went on, her voice wrapped in a kind warmth that seemed to thaw the icy air. "I've lost everything I thought mattered. I've cried nights on end, convinced I'd never see light again. But you know what I learned?" She leaned forward slightly, as if sharing a precious secret. "I learned that God is good. All the time. Even when our world feels like it's falling apart." Lucas looked at her, half skeptical, half curious. The last thing he wanted was to hear about faith, about empty promises. He had seen firsthand the gap between pretty words and hard reality. But this woman, she wasn't speaking like someone trying to convince. She spoke like someone who had lived it. "Sometimes," she continued, now looking up at the sky darkened by heavy clouds, What feels like the end is just the beginning. Just because we don't see what God's doing doesn't mean He's not working. A lump formed in Lucas's throat. He thought of Olivia, of everything they had dreamed of building together. He thought about the vows he made at the altar, the plans for a lifetime. And now it all felt so distant, so impossible. But sitting there, next to this stranger who somehow felt familiar, something inside him started to pulse again. Timid, fragile, but alive. "You still have so much ahead, son," the woman said, almost as if she could hear his thoughts. "Don't hand your story over to despair. It's not the end. It just looks like it." She stood up slowly, adjusting the bag on her arm. Lucas wanted to say something, thank her, ask who she was, where she came from. But the words stuck, and all he could do was nod slightly. She smiled once more, that peaceful, knowing smile, and before she walked away, she placed something in his hand. A small, time-worn card with simple, faded letters that read, "God is good. All the time." Nothing else. No address, no name, no explanation. When he blinked, she was already gone, blended into the crowd as if she had never been there. Lucas sat there for a few minutes, holding the card between his fingers, feeling both the weight and the lightness of those words. The wind picked up, and a dry leaf landed on his lap, a silent reminder that seasons change, even when we don't notice. Lucas took a deep breath, tucked the card into his jacket pocket, and with shaky but determined steps got up. The city looked the same. The streets were still indifferent. But something inside him had shifted. Was he still scared? Absolutely. Was there still uncertainty? No doubt. But now there was also a small spark he couldn't ignore. A will to try one more time. Take one more step. He knew nothing would change overnight. The rent was still due. The problems were still waiting at home. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry it all alone. Maybe there was still meaning hidden in the rubble of his life. Lucas walked home, clutching the card like someone holding an invisible promise. One step at a time. One day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where rebuilding would begin. The house felt even quieter when Lucas walked through the door. The smell of the coffee Olivia had made earlier had faded, leaving behind a warm emptiness that filled every corner. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together on the scratched wooden surface, staring at some invisible spot on the wall. Her eyes lifted as soon as he entered, a mixture of relief and worry in her gaze. Lucas dropped his jacket on one of the chairs and sat down across from her without saying a word. For a few long seconds, silence was the only thing between them. A heavy silence, but also one that was begging for a bridge. And it was Olivia who built it. "You were out for a while," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. It wasn't a complaint, more like an observation from someone who missed him but didn't know if it was okay to admit it. "I needed to think," he answered, staring at the table. "I needed to breathe." She nodded, understanding more than he could express. Life had been heavy for both of them. And somehow, each had been trying to carry the pain without hurting the other even more. "Lucas," Olivia called, her voice gentle, like someone carefully holding a fragile string. "I know it's hard. I'm scared too. I still believe in us. I still believe we can get through this." He lifted his eyes to hers, and what he saw wasn't blame or disappointment. It was love. A tired, worn-out love, but steady. A love that said, "I'm here," without needing any words. Lucas felt the tears rising again, but this time he didn't fight them. He let them fall freely, washing away a bit of the pain he'd been carrying for so long. Olivia got up, walked around the table, and knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around him with all the strength she had left. There were no promises, no guarantees, but there was the choice to stay. Keep fighting. They stayed like that for what felt like forever, just feeling each other's presence. And in that embrace, Lucas understood something the old woman had tried to tell him. Rebuilding doesn't start when everything is fixed. Rebuilding starts when you decide not to give up, even when you have no idea how things will work out. Later that night, as the cold set in even deeper, they laid down together in their small bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Lucas stared at the ceiling, listening to Olivia's breathing next to him. Every problem still existed. The debts, the uncertainty, the fear of tomorrow. Nothing had magically disappeared. But there was something new, too. Something small, almost imperceptible, but real. A quiet decision not to give up. Try one more time. Take one more step. He remembered the card still tucked inside his jacket pocket. Without making a sound, he reached for it and held it in his hand like an anchor. God is good. All the time. The words whispered into the darkness, wrapping around his fear. Not erasing it, but not letting it win either. There, in the middle of the chaos, with no promises of ease, no clear signs that everything would be okay, Lucas made the hardest and bravest choice of all. He decided to keep going. And that tiny, invisible choice would become the seed of something new that was already being prepared. The sun had barely risen when Lucas got out of bed. The room was still wrapped in shadows, and Olivia slept soundly, her hair spread out over the pillow. For a second, he thought about crawling back under the covers, about postponing the battle he knew he'd have to face. But then the image of the old woman, her calm smile, her words of hope. He got up quietly, threw on his worn-out jacket, and with the faded card tucked safely in his pocket, stepped out into a still sleepy world. The city felt different at that hour. Less rushed, less noisy. Almost like it too was trying to start over just like he was. Lucas knew he couldn't sit around waiting for a miracle. He needed to move. So he started with what he could do. He printed out resumes at a small copy shop that allowed him to pay later. Then, with a stack in hand, he walked the streets, handing out his name and his story to anyone willing to listen. Coffee shops, small stores, local markets. No job felt too small. Each resume he handed out was a silent act of faith, a quiet declaration that he still believed something good could happen. The hours dragged on, and every polite no he received weighed a little heavier. But somehow, unlike before, each rejection didn't break him. That card in his pocket, it felt like it was carrying an invisible promise, that his worth wasn't measured by his circumstances or by what he had lost. Meanwhile, Olivia was fighting her own silent battles. After staring into the near-empty pantry that morning, she decided she needed to do something too. She called an old friend and managed to pick up some hours working at a nearby community center, caring for children. It wasn't much, but it was something. And right now, something was enough. That night, when they both finally made it home, they were exhausted. Their clothes smelled like sweat and dust, and their faces bore the heavy marks of the day. But there was something new in their eyes, a glimmer that wasn't defeat. It was resilience. Hope. Sitting side by side on the narrow porch of their apartment, two mismatched mugs of cheap tea in their hands, Lucas and Olivia exchanged a look full of unspoken understanding. They had made it through another day. Not perfectly, not triumphantly, but they had moved one step beyond the pain, one step beyond hopelessness. And even though they were still at the very start of a long, hard road, they knew one thing for sure. They were walking it together. Today was hard, Lucas said, his voice rough with fatigue. It was, Olivia replied, resting her head on his shoulder. But we're still here. Lucas slipped his hand into his pocket, clutching the card like a piece of solid ground under his feet. It was a quiet reminder that rebuilding doesn't always start with a grand moment. Sometimes it starts with shaky, tearful steps. Steps that hurt but are still steps forward. And deep down, Lucas knew, as long as he was willing to take one more step, the path would still exist. Even if he couldn't see it yet. Even if every step hurt. Because sometimes, the greatest miracle isn't the change that happens around you. It's the transformation that starts silently and deeply inside you.